Thanks for tuning in to Curious Cat, the podcast that examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. I'm your host, Jennifer Holtz. Join me every week as I explore what it means to be a soul in a meat suit. Welcome to Curious Cat. With this video game we call reality getting so wild as of late, I thought it was a good moment in time to dance on the bridge to heaven. If near-death experiencers are right in their accounts, heaven is our true home. All of us. It is rife with colors, music, and unconditional love. We need a bit of that chicken soup for the soul right now, don't we? Let's channel our inner Led Zepplin and climb the stairway or maybe the bridge to heaven. First, a little Heaven 101. Heaven, Nirvana, Eden, Paradise, Cielo, Valhalla, Zion, on high, Empyrean, bliss, Elysian fields. The concept of heaven is shared by cultures across the globe. In Old English, heofon, meaning home of God. In German, Himmel, heaven or sky. Ancient Greeks had a few names for heaven too. Elysium, Ouranos, which referred to sky or heaven. In Hebrew, Shamayim. In Hinduism, Svarga, which is the celestial abode of the gods. In Maori, Rangi, which was presided over by two gods. So what's the first written record of heaven that we have? And when does it date back to? Google pointed me to the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation, but I wasn't satisfied. I kept poking around and came across a post that gave me goosebumps. Written by Joe Boyd, the deconstructed pastor. I found his reaction to a criticism he received about one of his TikTok videos intriguing. His post begins thus. This post is lovingly dedicated to small-town tourists who commented this on my TikTok yesterday after I mentioned I wasn't sure I believed in a literal heaven. He said, "You're not a true Christian." I'm summarizing the picture. But this is what he wrote in response. A brief history of heaven. Confession. When I was an evangelical kid, I grew up thinking heaven would be a never-ending worship service. If you went to the church I did, you'd understand why I wasn't exactly looking forward to it. But alas, better than physically burning in conscious torment forever. So I take it. I held out some hope that it could be fun. Maybe my pets who passed would be there, until the pastor said in a sermon that no animals go to heaven because only humans have souls. Okay, well, at least my grandparents would be there, unless they weren't baptized the right way. So hell for them too. Sigh. As I got older, I never really found a way to be happy about the Christian heaven I was told awaits me after death. Escaping hell seemed more important, and then all hell actually broke loose for me. After Bible college, I decided to do something novel. I read the Gospels closely, and what I found in Jesus's message was very little emphasis on the afterlife. When he talked about heaven, it seemed to cling to earth more than anything else, and at times he said it was already here. Okay, see, I have goosebumps again. So early on in my deconstruction, or maybe what you'd call my pre-deconstruction, I decided to figure out what heaven actually meant in the Bible and how it evolved into a never-ending hymn sing-along with no dogs or grandparents. So here it is, a brief history of heaven. In the beginning, there was no heaven, sort of. The Hebrew scriptures don't give us anything close to the modern idea of heaven. There was no eternal life in paradise, no glowing clouds, no harps, no reunions with grandma, and definitely no reward-based afterlife for the faithful. Instead, there was Sheol. Sheol was the default. Everyone went there. Good, bad, faithful, wicked, it didn't matter. It wasn't a place of punishment. It wasn't a place of reward. It was a place, dark, quiet, shadowy, a pit, a grave, a memory hole. Sometimes people there are described as sleeping. Other times they're shades, half-alive echoes. Either way, the general vibe was not singing, "I love you, Lord," with the angels. But what about Enoch and Elijah? In Genesis 5:24, we're told Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. And in 2 Kings 2, Elijah is famously swept up in a chariot of fire, disappearing into the sky. To later readers, these might look like early raptures, but to the original audience, these weren't maps of the afterlife. They were mystical exceptions, special cases, divine mysteries, not instructions. Stories like these show up in other cultures too. Babylonian, Greek, Persian. The idea that a great man was taken or lifted wasn't new. It just wasn't normal. Ghosts, witches, and the afterlife loopholes. Then there's 1 Samuel 28, where King Saul visits the witch of Endor and asks her to summon the dead prophet Samuel. And it works. Samuel rises from Sheol, annoyed he's been disturbed, and reminds Saul his fate is sealed. So yeah, the Hebrew Bible has ghosts too. Elsewhere in Job, Psalms, Isaiah, you find people asking, can the dead praise God? Do they remember anything? Is death the end? The answers are mixed. They're vague, unsettled. Nobody knows. The Hebrew scriptures weren't unified in their afterlife views or eschatology, just haunted by the same questions we still ask today. What changed? Empire, exile, and outside ideas. As Israel lived under Babylonian, Persian, and Greek empires, new ideas crept in. Babylonians imagined a bleak underworld. Zoroastrianism introduced cosmic dualism, heaven versus hell, light versus dark, and the Greeks gave us Plato, who taught that your soul is eternal and your body is just a temporary cage. Okay, I have to make a note right here, because do you resonate with pieces of all of those? Yeah, me too. By the time of Jesus, Judaism had split into factions. Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection at all. Pharisees did. Apocalyptic sects imagined fiery judgment and vindication for the righteous. In other words, there was no clear Jewish view of the afterlife. There were many. Jesus didn't preach heaven as the afterlife, at least not the way we're taught. Jesus didn't show up with a fully formed theology of the afterlife. What we see, especially in the synoptic gospels, is a prophet announcing that the kingdom of heaven, or God, is here now among us. It wasn't about flying away. It wasn't about justice breaking in. It was liberation, healing, mercy, a reversal of power. Heaven was not a reward. It was a reality trying to get through the cracks of this existence. But what about the afterlife references? Yeah, Jesus sometimes talked about the afterlife, like when Jesus of Luke tells the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." But paradise wasn't synonymous with heaven. It was a temporary resting place for the righteous dead, closer to a peaceful shell than a golden mansion. Same with parables like the rich man and Lazarus or the sheep and the goats. They're not really afterlife roadmaps. They're moral punches. Stories meant to shock, not systematize. If you want more on this, he's got an article called The Brief history of hell, which I will be touching on next week when I have the Bridge to Hell episode. But he continues in his article, resurrection, not escape. What Jesus and the early Christians hoped for was resurrection, a renewed body, a renewed earth, a future where heaven and earth finally became one. Don't we all isn't that what we're seeking right now? N.T. Wright calls it the, quote, heaven-earth combo pact, end quote. Not life after death, but life after death. The earliest Christians, resurrection, not rapture. One of the most important things to remember when reading early Christian texts is how little time these people thought they had. They weren't writing for posterity. They didn't think they were building a religion. They thought heaven was about to break in fully and finally, not in centuries, in months, maybe weeks. And in one of the clearest windows we have into that mindset comes from a short letter written around 50 CE, just 20 years or so after Jesus was executed. It's called 1 Thessalonians, and it's widely considered the earliest surviving Christian writing. It's not systematic theology. It's a letter, urgent, grieving, apocalyptic, and it contained a line that ended up shaping centuries of speculation. The dead in Christ will rise first, then we who are still alive will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And again, that's from 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17. If you were raised in evangelical circles, that probably sounds familiar. It's the foundation for most modern rapture theology, but here's the thing. That's not what it meant at the time. What's really going on here, in his opinion, Paul, the writer, is drawing from Roman imperial culture, specifically the image of a city welcoming a visiting ruler. When an emperor or king approached, the people would rush out to meet him and then escort him back into the city in triumph. The Greek word Paul uses for meet, apantesis, literally refers to that kind of welcoming party. So this isn't about flying away. It's about meeting someone on their way in. The vision here isn't escape, it's arrival. Not we're leaving, but something's coming. What they were hoping for, however you feel about resurrection or end time theories, it's clear that the people writing these early texts weren't imagining heaven as a place you go to when you die. They were imagining the world being transformed, and soon. They talked about resurrection, justice, creation made whole, a new kind of life breaking through the cracks of the old one. They weren't waiting to get out. They were waiting for something to arrive. But Jesus didn't return right away, and as time passed, the church had to find a longer-term theology. They found it conveniently in Plato. Plato said your soul is eternal. Your body is the problem. Salvation is escape. And slowly that idea escaped into Christianity. Origin, Gnosticism, and the birth of the escape plan happened then. The first major theologian to really articulate this soul over body idea was Origen of Alexandria. He believed the soul pre-existed the body, that the body was a consequence of the soul's fall, and that salvation was about returning to God in a pure, disembodied form. Around the same time, Gnostic movements were saying something similar. The material world is a prison. Salvation is secret knowledge that helps your soul escape it. The church officially rejected Gnosticism, but it absorbed a lot of the same antibody worldview. Then came Augustine of Hippo, and that was circa 354 to 430 was his life. He added another layer, the doctrine of original sin. In his view, we're not just fragile or imperfect, we're born corrupted, and our bodies, especially their desires, are part of the problem, something to resist, maybe even escape. And I have to put a footnote here, because remember Joseph Campbell talking about the Garden of Eden story? And he was basically saying that that was the moment that we were pitted against everything that is natural in the life cycle. We were pitted against sexuality, against birthing kids, against making choices, our own free will choices. And I find it interesting because to me, it feels like a piece of the Bible that I've read. There are a number of them that don't feel like they were of God, but of somebody trying to inject their viewpoint into this book. And there we go. I've got the history on it. It was Augustine of Hippo. In his view, Augustine of Hippos, we're not just fragile or imperfect, we're born corrupted, and our bodies, especially their desires, are part of the problem. Sorry to repeat that part, but I just had to pull it full circle for my own brain. In the Middle Ages, heaven becomes the system. Fast forward a few centuries and heaven wasn't just the hope, it was the engine of the entire Christian system. I think of the institution of the church, right? That's trying to keep itself alive and relevant. From infant baptism to last rites, the church built a pipeline to heaven, complete with toll booths, godparents to vouch for you, confirmation to seal your faith, confession and penance to keep you on track, purgatory to burn off the extra sin, indulgences to speed it all up. What began as a message of good news became a transactional system where heaven was the reward for staying on script. The Reformation, heaven rebooted, kind of. If you've read his brief history pieces on hell and Christian nationalism, you already know the pattern. The Reformation reformed a lot, but not everything. Same with heaven. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other reformers flipped over tables when it came to indulgences, papal authority, and church corruption. But when it came to heaven and the afterlife, they mostly kept the blueprint. They just changed who had access to the door. What the reformers did reform, let's give credit where credit's due. The medieval system was spiritually exhausting and economically exploitative. The reformers called that out. They got rid of selling indulgences for a quicker path to heaven, prayers for the dead as transactional, priestly gatekeeping of grace. Instead, they emphasized salvation by faith alone. Grace is a gift, not a wage. Direct access to God, no spiritual middlemen required. Heaven, in their view, was still the end goal, but now it wasn't something you had to earn through rituals or payments. It was something God granted freely to those who believed. Well, that's a major shift. What they didn't reform, but even with all that fiery protest, the core heaven story stayed intact. They kept the notion that heaven is where the soul goes when you die. Earth is temporary. Salvation is primarily about the next world. They ditched purgatory altogether, at least in Protestant circles, but they didn't ditch the soul escape model. The idea of bodily resurrection, still technically part of the belief system, but like in medieval Catholicism, it got sidelined in favor of a simple binary. The process was you die, and then it's either heaven or hell. No new earth, no heaven coming here. Just believe now, go up later. And then we built new bureaucracies. Ironically, even without Rome, Protestants eventually created their own systems, doctrinal statements instead of indulgences, sinners' prayers instead of infant baptism, church membership and altar calls instead of sacraments. Same framework, new management. Heaven still functioned as the prize. You just didn't have to pay for it anymore, basically. The main thing to know, the reformers cracked the system wide open, but didn't change the destination. They protested how people got to heaven, but not why that was the point in the first place. The core assumption stayed in place. Heaven is up there. You want to go there. Everything in this life is just prep for that. Jesus said heaven was there. The medieval church said heaven was over there. The reformers said yes, and now you've got a better roadmap. Then there was the modern evangelical remix. Heaven got remarketed. After Reformation, the heaven story stayed basically intact for the next few years. Even in early American Christianity, Puritans, revivalists, early Baptists, the assumption remained, life is short, death is near. The goal is to be ready to fly upward when the time comes. But in the 1800s and beyond, something new started to emerge, something uniquely modern, uniquely American, and uniquely marketable. Revivalism, the birth of the spiritual sales pitch. As the Great Awakening swept across America, preachers didn't have time for nuanced theology. They had tents, pulpits, and a crowd of sinners to save right now. The message became simple. If you die tonight, do you know where you're going? And you see that echoed today, don't you? Heaven and hell became binary options, and belief became the switch you had to flip before time ran out. Complex theological frameworks got reduced to altar calls and sinner prayers. Heaven was the product, and the preacher was the salesman, and urgency was the close. Enter dispensationalism and the rapture. In the 1800s, a new end times view burst onto the scenes, dispensationalism, popularized by John Nelson Darby and later baked into the notes of the Scofield Reference Bible. This framework introduced the idea that Jesus would secretly rapture believers into heaven, leaving the rest of the world behind for a 7-year tribulation. This idea exploded with American evangelicals. Books, sermons, prophecy charts, movies, eventually the book series Left Behind, because nothing sells heaven like the fear of being left out. By the time most of us were born or converted into evangelical churches, which was from the 1970s through the early 2000s, and I love that one of my favorite musicians, Father John Misty, is a byproduct of that system. But anyway, he goes on. Dispensationalism had already won the cultural war, even if many of us didn't know the word. But this was a very new idea in the grand scheme of Christian history. It did not come from Jesus or Paul or the church fathers or reformers. It came from John Nelson Darby in the 1800s. That means over 90% of Christians throughout history never believed it. And yet by the late 20th century, it was on billboards, in sermons, and baked into how millions of us imagined heaven, hell, and the end of the world. And there were many versions of it. And he adds this beautiful pop-up to his article, which I have links to in the show notes. Please visit his Substack. It's incredible. Even if you're atheist, there is so much meat in what he's writing, right? Here's his quick glossary. Which end time story did you inherit? Pre-trib rapture. In that, Jesus secretly returns before the tribulation and takes the faithful to heaven, leaving everyone else behind for 7 years of chaos. There's the mid-trib rapture. Same idea, but believers are taken halfway through the tribulation. The post-trib rapture. Believers go through the full tribulation and are raptured just before Jesus returns visibly. There's the pre-wrath rapture, a slightly softer version. Christians face some trials, but not God's full judgment. Classical dispensationalism. History is divided into distinct dispensations. We're in the church age. Next comes the rapture, then a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Progressive dispensationalism. That's the modern attempt to tidy all this up with a bit more nuance, but still keeping the core ideas intact. Or maybe you grew up like me. Not everyone grew up with charts and timelines. Some evangelical traditions, like the independent Christian churches or the churches of Christ, where he came from, were mostly amillennial, meaning we didn't believe in a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth or any kind of rapture at all. But let's not pretend we were more enlightened. We didn't focus on escaping the tribulation. We focused on avoiding hell. And it was still about getting your soul right now, because you could die at any minute. And like most other groups, we were pretty sure our version of the end was the right one. If you believed differently, you were either naive, deceived, or not really biblical. Enter Billy Graham and the heaven formula. By the mid-20th century, Billy Graham made the heaven or hell decision the centerpiece of American Christianity. Massive stadiums, a single clear message. God loves you. Jesus died for you. You can go to heaven if you believe. And while it appeared Graham's heart was sincere, the simplicity of that message turned the entire Christian life into an afterlife transaction. Say the prayer, get the ticket, go to heaven. No need for resurrection hope. No mention of a renewed earth, just you, Jesus, and the ultimate destination. Getting to heaven had modernized and gained simplicity and efficiency. Just believe and say the prayer and you're in. It had also gone from Jesus saying, heaven is among you, to saying to us, it's later. The point of life isn't so much what happens now. It's about waiting to die to experience eternal bliss. That is so interesting, because so much of that Christian mindset is about, no, all your pleasures, all of your peace of mind, all of your joy, it awaits you in the afterlife. That's not what this earth life is about. Doesn't that resonate? We're supposed to go through this pain to get there. Heaven became less about transformation and more about transaction, less about the kingdom breaking in and more about you checking out. So he asks himself, what do I think now? I only know two things for sure. First, the concept of heaven I was given didn't come out of nowhere. It evolved, shaped by other ideas, some of them completely at odds with the version I was taught. Second, I don't know what happens when we die. I don't believe anyone does, though most people seem pretty confident they do. I hope there's something. I hope there's peace. I hope love wins. But these days I'm less focused on what comes later and more drawn to what's already possible now. That's partially why I still identify as a Christian. I resonate with Jesus' teachings on heaven breaking in. I like the way it makes me think about today. Heaven might not be a place we go. It might be a reality we glimpse from time to time, in forgiveness, in beauty, in justice, in ordinary moments that feel like they don't belong in this world, but somehow still do. Eternity might be a cosmic now, more than a forever then. Maybe heaven is what happens when we stop trying to escape one life for the next and start fully living the only life we know for sure that we have. Thanks for reading Joe Boyd, the Deconstructed Pastor. Okay, and I put his links in the Substack in the show notes. Please give him a follow there. He's got a lot of levels to subscribe, from free to an annual pass, and I think he is worth the follow. After a quick break, let's dive into the financials. Yeah, how expensive is a ticket into heaven? Back in a minute.
Hi, I'm Derek Condit with Mystical Wares. I've recently published 2 books. The first is titled Shungite Unveiled. It's an FAQ and hidden insights to the miraculous mineral called shungite and how it can be used to help save the bees. It also contains chapters on shungite and healing, shungite in plants, the Shungite Grid Project, as well as ways to use shungite with animals and in construction. So it's a large FAQ or accumulation of ways to use shungite in everyday life. Then the second book I released is called Everyday Magic, and it's inspirational stories of intuition and awakening. So it's a collection of 18 short stories that I put together that can help to explain some of the metaphysical aspects of our reality that we're all experiencing. Either of these books are available at mysticalwares.com or Amazon. There's also additional information on how to help save the bees with our Shungite Beehive project. That also can be found at mysticalwares.com. We appreciate your support.
Welcome back. How much are tickets to heaven? Quora says it's $14.99 to buy your place and $3.99 to rent a spot. They also cheekily mentioned that rental is free if you have Amazon Prime. Fundamentalist Christians remind followers that the price is free as long as you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Okay, fine. So is it possible to find heaven on earth? AI had a very interesting answer. Finding heaven on earth can be understood in two ways, as a literal attempt to replicate paradise on earth or as a metaphor for finding joy and fulfillment in everyday life through spiritual connection and positive actions. Ultimately, it's about cultivating a mindset that values love, compassion, and a connection to something larger than oneself. Literal attempts at heaven on earth. Okay, some communities and individuals have attempted to build or create heaven on earth through intentional communities, spiritual retreats, or utopian projects. These efforts often involve a focus on community living, sustainable practices, and shared values. Some examples that AI included are Arco Santo, a city in the Arizona desert built on the idea of a simple, sustainable life, though it hasn't achieved its initial goals. There's metaphorical finding of heaven on earth. This perspective emphasizes the importance of cultivating a spiritual connection, practicing gratitude, and finding joy in everyday experiences. It involves setting one's affections on things above, following a spiritual path, and living a life of purpose and meaning. This can be achieved through prayer, meditation, spending time in nature, engaging in acts of kindness, and fostering strong relationships. Here are a few key takeaways. Finding heaven on earth is a personal journey, and there's no single way to achieve that. Whether it's a literal attempt at paradise or a metaphorical quest for fulfillment, it often involves a focus on community, spiritual connection, and living a life of purpose. It's a reminder that even in the midst of challenges, there's always potential for joy, peace, and a sense of connection to something greater. Bits that caught and captured my attention in that the most, the idea of communities that are endeavoring to create a heaven-like existence on earth. Okay, sitting behind this mic for almost 4 years now, I've researched lots of subjects, and this sentence calls to mind cults. Some began with similar pie-in-the-sky notions, but they turned into control camps in a matter of months. So I admit I come to this with a bias, but it made me want to research Arco Santi, the city that AI mentioned. Here's what I found. Arco Santi is a projected experimental town with a molten bronze bell casting business in Yavapai County, central Arizona, United States. 70 miles north of Phoenix at an elevation of 3,732 feet. Its arcology concept was proposed by the Italian-American architect Paolo Soleri, who died in 2013. He began construction in 1970 to demonstrate how urban conditions could be improved while minimizing the destructive impact on Earth. He taught and influenced generations of architects and urban designers who studied and worked with him there to build the proposed town. Here's a simple overview. The goal of Arco Santi is to explore the concept of arcology, so combining architecture and ecology. The project had the goals of combining the social interaction and accessibility of an urban environment with sound environmental principles, such as minimal resource use and access to the natural environment. The project has been building an experimental town on 25 acres of a 4,060-acre land preserve, 860 acres of which are owned by the Cosanti Foundation, with the remainder leased from the state. Ground was broken in 1970, and that's when construction began. The goal of Arcosanti was to house a population of 5,000 people, but it basically is about 75 people right now. At the most, I think it held about 150 people. And actually, interestingly, you can rent a room there on Airbnb, and there's mixed reviews of it. Some people thought it was kind of creepy because there was just a skeleton crew. People said on the weekdays it's especially empty of people, and it's more busy on the weekend when they get tourists. A lot of architects do kind of come back to it as a touchstone. And you know what? People ask, is it a cult? Well, the jury is still out. It's not officially defined as a cult, but has been described as having cult-like aspects by some. Here's why some people associate Arcosanti with cult-like characteristics. The founder's influence. Okay, Paolo Soleri, the architect who founded Arcosanti, he's sometimes described as inspiring a cult-like following among his supporters. Centralized beliefs. The community is based on Soleri's vision of a self-sustaining urban environment, and its residents are committed to his ideas. Structure and hierarchy. Reports suggest a hierarchy structure within Arcosanti, with those who have lived there longer potentially having preferential treatment. Concerns about Soleri's personal life? Okay, trigger warning. There are allegations of sexual abuse made by Soleri's daughter that have raised questions about his character and leadership, potentially impacting how people view Arcosanti. Some connect these concerns to the notion of a patriarchal or hippie cult leader figure. However, it's important to note Arcosanti describes itself as an urban lab and an educational center focusing on sustainable living and architecture. The community attracts students and visitors interested in these concepts, and Arcosanti is largely sustained by volunteers who contribute to its construction and maintenance. Some observers have simply characterized the environment as peaceful and inspiring. Ultimately, whether Arcosanti is considered cult-like is a matter of perception and definition. It's a unique social experiment with both admired and controversial aspects. And one final note I mentioned earlier, Soleri died in 2013 in his home. There's little doubt to the power of music to give us energy during a long workout, to change a mood, to set a backdrop for a family road trip, and even more. For me, music is a taste of heaven. And interesting to note that many near-death experiencers mention the music of heaven, specifically when they return to old terra firma. One NDEer later composed music in an effort to recreate those angelic celestial songs, admitting that he still hasn't quite got it right. There are iconic songs with heaven in the title, and I wanted to share the stories behind two of them with you. First up, Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven. Adam Gold wrote this for AmericanSongwriter.com, and find links to this article in the show notes. There's a reason why Robert Plant refuses to reunite with his surviving Led Zeppelin bandmates for a lucrative world tour. No amount of money is worth having to sing Stairway to Heaven like you mean it, night after night after night. It's a sentiment he expressed time and again for more than 30 years. If you ask a 70s disc jockey, he'll tell you rock and roll crypto mythology determines that each performance of Stairway to Heaven takes years off a rock musician's life. This is actually addressed directly in Led Zepp's legendary concert film called The Song Remains the Same. In it, Jimmy Page climbs a misty, mystical mountain in search of a mythical hermit, only to find he is the hermit. He then stares in horror and disbelief as his doppelganger ages into an elderly wizard before his own eyes, and he realizes his shadow's taller than his soul. Every legendary artist has that one track that's bigger than themselves, a song as influential a rock cornerstone as it is an albatross around their legacy. legacy. For Led Zepp, it's Stairway to Heaven, a cut that was to FM radio what The Godfather was to cinema, an epic unrivaled in its grandeur and incalculable in its influence. Released on their 1971 LP, Led Zeppelin 4, Stairway isn't necessarily the greatest song the band ever wrote, but it's unequivocally the most significant, a signature staple that plays like a trailer for their entire discography. In 7 minutes and 55 seconds, Stairway traversed all the sonic hallmarks that define Led Zepp's sound, from fairy tale acoustic folk to sex-laden swampy grooves, and ultimately braying blues-based hard rock, and delivers them with dire token-worthy medieval urgency. In those same 8 minutes, it set the stage for just about every stadium-sized cliche since, taking the genre to new, unprecedented levels of ridiculous rock and roll audacity. Before there was yelling "Free Bird" at a concert, there was playing Stairway at the guitar shop. Before Pentecostal parents accused Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest of pulling Kevorkians on their kids with backmasked subliminal messages, they cited Stairway, in reverse of course, as the smoking gun. For generations of teens, Stairway has been the soundtrack to countless bong rips, slides into second base, and roadside fatalities. It popularized the double neck guitar, yielding lifetimes of back problems for shredders worldwide. Every time you flick your Bic to illuminate a dark arena into a rock and roll galaxy, you're praising Stairway's legacy. And while the hackneyed jokes and Wayne's World references that punctuate that legacy are more than earned by its overwrought cadence of foggy mysticism, loose social commentary, feigned depth, and interminable live performances, at the time of its release, the song was no laughing matter. Never officially released as a single, Stairway prevailed as rock radio's most requested song of the 70s, thus priming the airwaves for every subsequent torch-cueing opus, from Bohemian Rhapsody and War Pigs to The Wall and Freebird. Stairway ushered in the era of album-oriented rock, and for the better or for the worse, paved the way for prog. It's probably singularly responsible for Rush's entire career, as well as every eye-rolling Iron Maiden lyric to boot. While history and hindsight handily frame Stairway as one big bloated sonic platitude, it's important to remember that it does indeed rock, and listening to it is visceral. It's a visceral experience. It begins with an atmosphere of stark serenity, nestling Jimmy Page's finger-picked acoustic arpeggios in a comforting chorus of mellotron recorders, courtesy of John Paul Jones, as Plant solemnly sings the plight of a God-fearing, miserly old woman. As the minor-tinged tranquility marking Stairway's first half turns to a foreboding tension, a simple quarter-note drum fill brings John Bonham into the mix, and Led Zeppelin settles into a steady mid-tempo groove. But not for long. A royally triumphant interlude strips the song of its moody subtleties and shifts the track into fourth gear. From there on out, it metastasizes into a hard rock tour de force that rocks harder with increasingly less restraint as it careens and crescendos through monstrous heavy metal movements. By the song's 7th minute, they've lost all control. Bonham is flailing and filling with the most thunderous bombast, driving the band in double time as Page delivers arguably his most show-stopping guitar solo in a catalog replete with show-stopping, gutsy guitar solos. When Plant re-enters for his final verse, he's seething, possessed, fighting a battle for his very soul. Once they've left all they've got on the floor, Stairway simmers down to a placid lull, and Plant reprises its opening lyric, sounding as if he's aged 100 years in the 8 minutes that have elapsed. As the song itself notes, sometimes words have two meanings. The meaning behind the lyric seems, if nothing else, infinite. Lyrically, the tune has dazed and confused many a mind-altered listener with its vague take on duality for the better part of a half century. But more often than not, lyrics say more with how they feel than what they really mean. And while Stairway is seemingly a song about the inevitability of death, that's really a song about fear, but actually a song about greed or something, Plant communicates its sweeping vagaries with a passionate, pensive, and ultimately primal delivery that convinces the listener he knows exactly what he's singing about, and really, that's enough. Okay, a sad note to Stairway to Heaven. Hawaii's iconic and literal Stairway to Heaven, also called Haiku Stairs, is being torn down. After being trekked by countless adventurers, the stairs were deemed unsafe. Some say it's the result of bad behavior on the part of tourists. Oh, and the contract to remove the stairs? $2.5 million. Oh my gosh. The work to dismantle the stairs on Oahu began in April 2024. R.I.P. Stairway to Heaven. Oahu's still worth visiting though, both for the epic Bishop Museum where you can visit the stone man Kane that I wrote a horror story about that was turned into a video by my friend Edward October. And it's also great to visit for Leonard's Malasadas. Both are worth the plane ride. And finally, a little information about Knockin' on Heaven's Door. From Steam It, Blazik writes, Knockin' on Heaven's Door is a song by singer-songwriter Bob Dylan, released in 1973 on his 12th studio album and his first soundtrack album made for the film Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which was released the same year as the album. Here's a little backstory. Bob Dylan's acquaintance Rudy Wurlitzer, who was the scriptwriter for Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, asked Dylan if he was up for providing a couple of his songs for the movie that they were making. And Dylan wrote the lyrics of the song from the perspective of a dying sheriff living his last moments. Okay, for the meaning of the song's iconic lyrics, I turn again to American Songwriter, who says the meaning of the song, of course, refers to death. It's getting dark. Too dark to see, sings Dylan. Dylan biographer Clinton Halen describes the track as, quote, an exercise in splendid simplicity, end quote. Others would point out its brevity and wonder if Dylan just forgot to keep writing. Featuring 2 quick verses, the lyrics touch on the scene for the movie Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, in which it appears. That scene involves the death of frontier lawman Slim Pickens, who calls his wife Mama. From the specific comes the universal, because it's so brief and because it deals with a subject every human being is going to encounter in his or her life. The song has a timeless feel. The moment everything is wiped away and the final breath is taken, it's become something of a soundtrack for that point in one's life. The end. It's getting dark, too dark to see. One other note from American Songwriter. The song has been covered by 150 artists and likely more. Prominent offerings include those from Neil Young, Lana Del Rey, Nick Cave, Patti Smith, Paul Simon, Bono, Bon Jovi, Cat Power, Roger Waters, Jerry Garcia, Avril Lavigne, Wyclef Jean, and more. It's a veritable who's who. Oh, and one final story about the song and that incredible talent that is Bob Dylan. Author Rudy Wurlitzer, again, the screenwriter of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, shared this admiration for Bob Dylan with an Indonesian children's book author, Kurniawan. In an interview, he said he especially admires the circumstances under which and the speed with which the bard managed to fabricate that song, saying, quote, Bob wrote the film score in Mexico City, Wurlitzer said, but before that, one night when we were returning to Durango from Mexico City, I forgot why we were there. He said he wanted to write something for Slim Pickens' death scene, which was due to be shot the next day. He scrawled something on the airplane and showed it to me line by line, and when we got off the plane, there it was, knocking on heaven's door. I hope the conversation about heaven helps you see the world around you and the daily grind in a different light. Reach for heaven right now. Sometimes heaven is as simple as a clean pair of socks on your feet, a safe place to lay your head at night, and food in the fridge for tomorrow. It might be the way your furry best friend greets you when you return home, or a moonlit walk around your neighborhood. Better find and savor that slice of heaven, because next week, we're visiting the bad place. Until then, stay curious. I love you.